As Luke said, we are into our new series, Audacious. It's going to be an incredible series, about 4 weeks long, and we're going to be looking into what it means to be audacious. And it's all around having faith, audacious faith. Now, who would say they've got enough faith? Cool, that's good. I was hoping their hands went up. So I think we could all do with more faith, couldn't we? However much faith we've got, however good you're feeling, I think we could all do with a little bit more faith. But this series has been put together with the hope of making you feel more bold on the back of it, to have a boldness about your faith, a strength about what it is you believe. And wherever you are today, whether you are full or whether you're empty, today is a chance to step forward in your faith. Now I think I'm going to split the room with this next comment. Because I realise that it's less than 3 months to the big day, Christmas Day. I'm already getting some shakes over the head. I think there's two kinds of people in the room. There's the people who are already starting to get excited, and there's the people who are like, come on, there's plenty of time to go. Now it's a little bit too soon, don't worry. But I do want to use a Christmas film as an illustration today, and I hope that's okay. I know it is a little bit soon, but who's seen the film Elf? Yeah, hands up. Who likes the film Elf? It's a great film. For Christmas, I've got to watch Elf and Home Alone. If I watch those two, Christmas is done for me. I actually met Will Ferrell the other year. Here we are. It's probably not good enough to see. It's actually a cardboard cutout. It's not a real Will Ferrell. But there's a scene within that film towards the end. I won't give anything away. It was from the 90s, so if you haven't seen it yet, it's not really a spoiler alert. But there's a point at the end of the film where Santa Claus has come to Earth. And his sleigh's broken down, and there's not enough Christmas cheer, and there's not enough Christmas spirit to get back off the ground. And he has, on his sleigh, a clausometer. And the reason that I bring this up today is, it's not about Father Christmas and Santa Claus, but I believe today, some of us, it's our faithometer, and I think that it's really down low. And today, and throughout this series, I want to inspire us to raise our faith levels, to raise that faithometer. I don't even know if that's a word, I've made it up, but we're going with it. Raise that faithometer, get it up the scale, and spoiler alert, it all went well in Elf. They're all full of Christmas cheer, and Santa Claus can take off again. And I believe through this series, the same thing can happen. Our faith can be lifted up, and we can go on to take bold and courageous steps even. But what does audacious mean? I'm throwing this word around, but what does audacious actually mean? It means showing a willingness to take surprisingly bold risks. Now, when you think about your life and your faith, would you say that it's audacious? Would you say that you take surprisingly bold risks? I think we could all, wherever we are, we could all take even bolder risks. And that's what I want to talk to you today. But I want to go back and tell you a story from probably about 30 years ago or so. And it's about my dad. Some of you have met him, he's been over a few times, but he's not here to defend himself today, so I can use this story. So probably about 30 or so years ago, we were going on a day trip in the UK to a theme park. I don't know if you've ever done that in the UK, but you have to be up very early, you have to get there, otherwise you're not going to get in the queues along. We'd obviously not set off quite as early as my dad had hoped. We get quite near to the theme park, and there's a queue off the motorway, and there's a queue all the way in. So my dad does, of course, what all dads do. He takes matters into his own hands and thinks, I'll come up with a solution. So it was my parents, me and my sister, and my two grandparents. Now, for those of you doing the math, that is 6 of us in a 5-seater car. This was the 90s in the UK, you could get away with that sort of thing. I was probably lying across somebody. But my dad's driving, and his father-in-law sat next to him, so my dad goes onto the hard shoulder, which you're not allowed to do, goes up the whole line of traffic, cuts in, gets onto the other side, goes around the roundabout, tucks in at the front, and gets into the front of the queue, only about 3 or 4 cars from the front. Now, all the way along, my grandfather's like, Ian, you can't do it, stop, pull in, we're not going to be okay. My dad goes for it. We get to the front, they allow us through, they don't kick us to the back of the queue, we get through, and no more than a handful of cars later, they shut the gates because they were full. So, we were very pleased. Dad done a good thing. Dad was on a mission. He wanted to get us in. He planned to take us to the theme park, and he was going to get us in. But he had his father-in-law sat next to him saying, don't do it, don't take the risk. But my dad, in that moment, he's been a little bit audacious. Some people would say the audacity of the man and use it in a negative sense. And I think, if you were the car where they said, no, it's full, you must have been thinking, that guy just stole my space. But he was audacious, he got us into the event. And that's just a little silly story, a little illustration. But it's about having audacious faith. And you know what? Sometimes that's awkward, isn't it? Being audacious. I don't know if you've ever done, I'm nowhere near the driver that my dad is when it comes to pushing in, but I will jump a little queue if I can. But I don't know if you've ever tried doing that, and you pull up next to somebody, and the person you're trying to push into is looking at you, and you know they're looking at you, and you're just like, looking anywhere but at them. There's something about this a little bit of awkwardness, but sometimes we've got to push through the awkwardness to get to the other side, and that's what we need to be doing. I think we need to step out of being tame Christians and be Christians who live audacious lives. Stepping out and taking audacious decisions is a risk. And sometimes risks involve failure. There was a chance that when we got into the front of that queue, the person at the ticket booth could have said, hang on, you've just pushed in, get to the back. They didn't, thankfully, and we had a good day. But that's the worst thing that would have happened, isn't it? We'd have got sent to the back of the queue. But sometimes you've got to take these audacious steps. And we're going to look today through the Bible in Luke 5. If you've got your Bibles, we're going to read quite a bit of that today. It might be worth opening them up. And we're going to follow two stories, and they kind of overlap with each other. And what's interesting is there's no coincidence that these two stories overlap, and as we go through, you'll see the similarities and the differences between them both. But if you've got your Bibles, it's going to come on the screen if you haven't. It's Mark 5. And it's verses 21 to 24, and it goes as follows. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogues, Jairus by name, and seeing him, fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be well and live. And he went with him. Now this story comes on the back of the relatively famous story in the Bible where the disciples of Jesus are in a boat and there's a storm and Jesus is sleeping away and he's having a great time. He knows it's going to be okay. He's sleeping. The disciples are very worried and they come and wake him up, and he comes up and he calms the sea, just demonstrating the power that he has. He's starting to become more famous at this point. People are starting to know who he is. And he's been over the other side because he's been healing someone who's demon-possessed, and this has just happened. And immediately they get on the boat and they land, and there's this crowd. People are starting to know about Jesus. They're starting to hear about him. This is actually only a chapter before the feeding of the 5,000. So when it says a crowd, we don't know exactly how many, but there's quite a few people starting to gather around Jesus. They want to know what's going on. They want to hear the stories. They want to see the miracles happening. And you have this man called Jairus, whose daughter's unwell, and he comes to Jesus. And he doesn't just come to Jesus, but he gets down on his knees and he implores Jesus. He's desperate. The situation is obviously really bad. He wants to get an audience in front of Jesus. He's audacious. There's a crowd of people here who want to hear and speak to Jesus and see what he's doing. But Jairus gets through that crowd and he gets up to Jesus. And he says, he shares his story with Jesus. And Jesus goes with him to heal the little daughter. So we're going to pick that back up in verse 24, and it says the following. Here we go. And a great crowd followed him and thronged around him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians. And she spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that was healed of disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, Who touched me? and he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." I think this moment is an even more audacious moment than Jairus, because Jairus was a religious leader, and it would have been acceptable for him to have come up to Jesus and to have chatted and shared the story. But for this woman to have come up, there's so many reasons for her not to have stepped forward and come into this moment. At that time, for all women, they were bleeding, they were classed as unclean. They couldn't come out, they couldn't be in public, and if they were around anybody else, they would make them unclean. But this lady had had it for 12 years. She would have been confined to very private spaces, mostly her home. When she came out, she couldn't have interacted with people. Mainly it was culture, but it was more than culture. It was even the laws that she couldn't be out and about. Yet, she pushes through the crowds, and she gets to Jesus. And when she speaks to him, it says she fell down before him and told him her whole truth, and told him her story. And do you know what's interesting about this is obviously we hear Jairus' name and he was a religious leader. But the contrast to this woman is that we never actually hear her name. She's just the woman who'd been bleeding. But when it comes to the end, what I love about it is Jesus refers to her as this daughter. Even more intimate than saying her name, he calls her daughter. Today, even if you feel like a nobody, you are somebody to Jesus. Culture would have dictated that she shouldn't have been around, but she knew that she had to get there. Jesus was interested in her. Jesus cared about her. She was audacious. Would she have been accepted? What was going to happen to her as she walked through the crowd to try and get to Jesus? I imagine that there were some people telling her that she shouldn't have been there to get back from them, knowing that they would become unclean. The chances are most of them would have known who she was, and therefore would have wanted to stay away from her. And she had to fight all these thoughts that would have been in her mind before going, but she had audacious faith. She was desperate. It says there that she spent all of her money. She was bankrupt. She had nothing else. And maybe she was at the end of herself and thought, if I can only get to Jesus, if I can only see him. The thing I love about her is that although culturally it would have been wrong to have gone into this situation, she'd obviously heard about Jesus. She knew who he was. And she wasn't as afraid of people as she was of God. She knew that she needed to get to Jesus to see him, and if she did, she would be healed. She has no money. She's hopeless. But she meets with Jesus. And whatever your situation is, Jesus is ready for you. Or however bleak, however bad you think it is, Jesus is ready for you. I'm sure that for her, she just wanted people, community. She wanted to be around people, but she couldn't. She was desperate. But I feel like she had this question in her mind of what if? What if I could get to Jesus? What if he did heal me? It would change everything. It would change my whole life. She audaciously makes a way to get there and to meet the Saviour. I love the faith that this lady had. And I imagine, as I say, the people putting her down and saying, you shouldn't be here, you shouldn't be doing this thing. And as I was thinking about our modern day world, it's such a toxic world at times, isn't it? And if you go on social media for anything more than 5 minutes, I'm sure you'll see a negative post. Even when there's good news posted, the comments will be negative. There'll be somebody who wants to have an opinion about something. And we live in this world where we hear all the time, we hear other people's opinions, we hear other people inputting into us, often negatively. And I think that's what this lady would have had. I don't think the world has changed that much. It's just that it's on a screen now rather than face to face. And this crowd would have been putting her down and saying she shouldn't have been there. But she pushes her way through to her. And Jesus was there for her. He was ready for her to meet him. And he's ready for you today to meet him too. One of the things I love about the Bible is as you read through different chapters, you start to pick up some of Jesus' qualities and some of his characteristics. And as I was reading it, I was really struck by this statement that he makes: "Who touched my garments?" And the reason is, I was thinking about it because I thought, well, did Jesus not know who it was? But Jesus is God. I think that Jesus knew who had touched him. But he was giving this lady an opportunity to respond to him. For those of you who were here last week, I talked about the lepers who were healed, and only one returned with thankfulness. And after that, Jesus said to that particular leper, he said the words, "Your faith has made you well." He spiritually healed him after physically healing him. And I think we're seeing a similar thing here actually, where Jesus is giving an opportunity for her to talk to him. She could have slipped off into the crowd, she could have been gone, she's healed, she'd had what she'd come for. But actually there was something more that Jesus wanted to do, if only that she would engage with him. And so she gets down on her knees and she tells Jesus her story. She shares what has happened, and the faith that she had, that if she even touched the hem of his garment, she would be healed. What incredible faith that is, first of all, to just think that if I just touch the hem of his clothes, I'll be healed. And at the end of all of that, we read the exact same phrase as we read last week: "Your faith has made you well." She turned up to have her body healed, but she left with something far more important: her soul was healed. She wasn't expecting that when she turned up. She simply wanted to be healed of this condition. But Jesus turned around and said, "Your faith has made you well." And as I was thinking about that crowd, there has to be other people in that crowd that were physically unwell. I know there would definitely be people who were spiritually unwell. How many of them, if they'd had audacious faith, could have been healed by Jesus that day? Any one of them, I imagine. We don't know because it didn't happen, but I'm sure Jesus could have healed any single one of them. But it was the lady who came with the audacious faith. She came intentionally. She wasn't just hoping to bump into Jesus. She made a way to touch him. I don't know if you've ever seen, I was trying to picture this in my mind. I think I shared last week, I call it Netflix the Bible, where I kind of imagine what it would look like in video form. And I don't know if you've ever seen celebrities like trying to go through a crowd and the bouncers are there, and imagine those are the disciples from let's get Jesus through. And I imagine that day that Jesus kind of bumped into many of the crowd as he was going through, trying to push his way through. But there was only one person who came and connected with him. There's a difference between bumping into Jesus and connecting with Jesus. And I think so often, even in church, we come in and we intend to bump into Jesus. We walk in and think, well, he'll be there. And he is, because where 2 or 3 are gathered, here he is. He is here. And we kind of almost stumble into him and bump into him. But we need to be more intentional than that. Yeah. We need to meet with him. I want to throw out a question to you, and it's this: when was the last time you prayed before coming to church and asked God to meet you? Because he will. He'll turn up. He'll be here. But there's a difference between turning up and hoping to bump into him and coming intentionally to meet with him. It says in Matthew 7, verse 7, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you." Find ways to reach out to Jesus today. And it's not just about church, I'm using that as an example, but in your personal time, when you're spending time with God, do you pray and say, "God, come and speak to me. Reveal what I'm doing well," with a more dangerous prayer. Reveal what I'm not doing well and help me to change. Because that's where we see ourselves transformed when we allow God to speak into those things. And I want to bring us back to that faithometer from the start. Because I think sometimes we're just resting on that bottom, and we need to be intentional and say, "God, I want to meet with you. I want my faith to be more." Sometimes you don't know how, but you just want it. And sometimes you just need to pray and say, "God, I want to meet with you. Meet with me." And I can assure you, He will. All of us can come into church or go into a time that God's around and leave unchanged. It's quite easy to do that. I've done it over the years when my heart's maybe been a little bit hardened for different reasons, and I've come into church and I've walked out and I've not really been impacted and I've not really changed. I want to encourage each one of you, come into church each week. expecting God to meet you, expecting God to change you. It's not about anything that I'm sharing. I believe this is a message from God for you, but it's not about me. I'm just the person delivering it today. It's all about our connection with God. He's the only one who can change. As pastors, there's not a lot we can do. We can speak and we can share, but we don't want you to be reliant on us and meet God through us. We want you to meet God directly, spend time with Him. The thing for this lady is that her audacious faith has got her a one-to-one with Jesus. And I think one of the things that is great about modern day life is that Jesus is here. And we get one-to-ones with Him all the time. You can have a one-to-one to Him in the car. You can have a one-to-one to Him in your front room, in your bedroom. You can have Him on the beach. And we almost have become so familiar with it that we've lost the excitement and the specialness of it. 2,000 years ago, if you wanted to meet Jesus, you had to be in a crowd, you had to find out where He was, and you had to make a way to get to Him. This lady got through a crowd to be with Jesus. And what's amazing is that Jesus spends time with this lady. He has this one-to-one, he says, tell me your story. She gets down and she shares her story. And I don't know if you twigged, but Jairus stood there. They were on their way to heal Jairus' daughter, and they would have been going together. Jairus has stood there in this moment where Jesus is just talking to this lady and saying, tell me your story. And if I'm Jairus, I'm thinking, oh Jesus, we should get going. We don't read any of that there. We hear that Jesus cares about this lady. He's interested in her life. And He's interested in each one of your stories and each one of your lives. But we are going to pick it back up into Mark again, and we're going to look at what's happening. So it says this: while Jesus, was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And He allowed no one to follow Him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. I think what's interesting here is that there's now mixed reports. You've got the earthly report, which is the guy coming from the house telling him, don't bother Jesus anymore. And then Jairus has also got Jesus saying, do not fear, only believe. And I think we, in this world, get so many mixed reports, don't we? We have the earthly report that says, it's no good, forget about it. But then there's God's report, which is different. Are we going to listen to God's voice, or are we going to listen to people's voice? Jesus is still on that mission, He's still ready to go. And there's voices that are saying it's too late. But Jesus said no, I'm still going to go. And He takes 3 of His disciples with Him. And this is intentional. Jesus always does everything with intention. There's a reason He's only taking 3 with Him. This is His kind of inner circle of the people He trusts the most, the voices that He wants around Him. And so we're going to read the next verse, which says, then they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when He'd entered, He said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at Him. I like the word of the use commotion there. I think it kind of paints a picture, doesn't it? A house of almost disarray, almost like a circus going on, negativity. And what was quite common in those days is that we had professional mourners. So people coming in and crying and weeping and wailing, and there'd been a lot of noise going on. Obviously, a little bit of time has passed because the person has come to Jesus and Jairus and they've walked back, and it's allowed time for these professional mourners to be there. Jesus goes in, and they're even laughing at Him. And they're laughing at Him, responding in such a way. But Jesus comes in and He takes authority of the situation, and He says this: but He put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with Him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, He said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Jesus had to make room. There was a lot of noise going on, there was a lot of commotion going on, there was a lot of voices inputting, a lot of sound all around. And Jesus, had sent him out the room. He's preparing for the miracle. And I think some of us need to do the same thing. We need to prepare the room for what God wants to do. There's a lot of noise, a lot of distractions. Maybe you need to mute that friend on social media that's always posting negative things. Maybe you need to pull away from an environment that you know isn't good for you. Maybe you need to stop following that influencer on Instagram that's causing you to think negatively. You don't need me to tell you what it is for you. I'm sure you can identify areas for yourself. But Jesus cleared the room. When Jesus cleared the house, he was taking authority over distraction. It wasn't a faith issue, it was a distraction issue. And that's really where I want to head today. This is all about distractions and cutting out distractions. But there is something interesting that, as I say, some of the story, they're intertwined with each other, aren't they? And there's differences and there's similarities. And I don't know if you noticed how old the little girl was, but she was 12 years of age. The exact same amount of years as the woman had been bleeding. And you think maybe that's a coincidence, but I don't think that's a coincidence. There's a reason that those two stories are there and that they intertwine with each other. It's almost like a collision of destiny that these two stories would be included, because I think there's something about audacious faith in both of the woman who'd been bleeding and Jairus. And the result of both of those audacious faith moves is that a miracle took place in both situations. We have an unclean, bankrupt woman and an innocent child, and both received healing from Jesus. Audacious faith leads to their healing. And if you're sat there today saying to me, well, this isn't really me, I'm not kind of an audacious faith kind of person, then there's a voice that's telling you that isn't true. Because if you make the decision to put Jesus as your Lord and Saviour, I'm telling you, that's a pretty audacious decision. That's a life-changing, audacious, bold decision. And I think for some of us, when we're feeling like our faith is low, it's not always a faith thing. Sometimes it is a distraction thing. We're distracted by other things. We're distracted by voices. Maybe we're distracted by temptation. Distracted by the culture around us and things that take our attention away from the real thing. But listen to Jesus and take authority, because you will see breakthrough. You know, in that situation, the whole crowd wants Jesus' attention, but it's those who audaciously approach that got it. And the other thing, Jesus kept just the three voices with him, just those three closest to him. He knew that they were going to bring something to that situation. They weren't going to cause a distraction. They weren't going to take him away from what he was there to do. Audacious faith grows when we silence distractions. And the enemy is brilliant at these distractions. He loves putting in little things, distracting us from what's really important. He loves undermining family, marriages, relationships, even relationships within church. But silence the distractions and take authority. Now, as I come into a close, for those of you who come regularly, you'll know that I love a prop, and today is no different. I've had a prop in my pocket the whole time. And this is probably my favourite ever gadget that I bought, and it's a set of headphones. And this is actually a new set because I broke my original set the other week, and I couldn't cope without them, so I had to buy a new set. Now these happen to be AirPods, Apple ones, but they can be any other brands. This is just the ones that I like. Now the interesting thing about these AirPods is that I can put them into my ears. They do two things. They're in right now, and I can have some music playing. In fact, I'm just going to play a bit of music. So I'm just listening to one of my favourite songs right now, which is Bless God, the song we sang earlier. That's playing into my ears. But right now, the headphones are allowing every other sound into my head. So I can still hear the fans. If you were talking, I'd be able to hear what you're saying. If a baby cries, I can hear that. It's all coming through. It's plugged straight into my ears. And so I actually can't hear the song that well. The volume's on low, but I can hear the fans coming through. There's distraction going on in my head. Now, the reason I love these headphones is I bought them a few years ago as I was working with some loud equipment and they made the sound less, because they've got something called active noise cancelling. And what it does is it hears the noise around and it blocks it out and it almost makes it silent in my head. What I have to do is press this little button here, and now I can't hear a thing. It's actually really disconcerting because I can only hear my own voice from inside my head. But I can't hear the fans anymore. I don't know if Daniel's crying or not, but I can't hear him if he is. I can't hear anything. I'm almost like taken away from what's around me. The distractions have been removed and I'm in the zone. Actually, take them out because it's quite off-putting when I'm trying to deliver something. But when I'm working, I can be sat in a cafe and I put my headphones in. The noise, the hustle and bustle of the cafe is gone. The coffee machine, that's my coffee machine noise, that's gone. All of these noises and distractions are taken away and I can focus on what I want to listen to. And I think that often we've got God playing into our minds through headphones like those. And sometimes we've got them on the wrong setting and we're allowing those sounds to still come in, we're allowing those distractions to come in and take away from what God is wanting to say. And we've got to switch it over and we've got to block out the distractions. We've got to take all those noises from around us and focus on the one sound that's more important than all, and that is Jesus' voice. When we silence those distractions, our audacious faith begins to grow. And the great thing is today, that whatever your circumstance, whatever your background, wherever you're at, Jesus is ready to meet with you. And he'll meet you where you are. You know the little girl, she needed Jesus to come to her home. But the lady simply went to Jesus and just needed a touch. God will meet you where you are. Come to Jesus. He wants to hear your story. He wants you to share with him. And through it, he wants to heal you. You know, we are in a society that's so full of noise. We can have stuff going on around us all the time. And these headphones are great. I love them. And often if you see me walking down the street, I'll be listening to them. But actually, sometimes they take away from what's really important, and that's spending time with God. Not through a podcast, not through a sermon, not even through worship music. Just stripping it all back and spending time with God. In the next chapter I already shared that we have the feeding of the 5,000. Immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus goes off on his own. Jesus, the Son of God, needs solitude. He needs space with his Father. And he needs it. I think we need it too. There's moments where we need to silence all other noise. Maybe for Jesus it was getting up the mountain, maybe it's that for you, maybe it doesn't have to be a mountain, but it's getting space away from the distractions in our world. And as we do that, we'll begin to see our audacious faith grow as we listen to the voice of God, not the voice of the crowd. So today, make your way through the crowd. We're all here wanting to meet with Jesus, but be intentional about it. Whenever you come into these moments where you know God is going to be, ask him to speak to you. Ask him to reveal himself to you, because he will, and he does. So today I want to leave you with two questions. Would you commit to silencing the distractions? Would you commit to silencing those distractions that come in around? Or would you commit to spending time on your own with Jesus? Because ultimately that's what's going to change you. Hopefully this preacher's shared something with you and encouraged you, but ultimately Jesus is the one who's going to change. He's the one who's going to transform. I can't transform your heart or mind, but Jesus can. Time with him is the most precious things. And this is just part one of the series. We've got, I think, three or four more parts to go. And if this has stirred something in you today, can I encourage you to come back next week? Liliana's going to be preaching next week. And we're going to go even further into this, because I would love, at the end of this series of Audacious, to have a room full of audacious people that are full of faith, that we're looking at and being like, whoa, we can't contain you, we've got so much faith. Because the God that we read about in the Bible is the same God of today. The miracles that we read about in the Bible are the same miracles that can happen today. God is here, He's in our midst, and He wants to meet with every single one of us.